The western plains stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of snow and wind, unforgiving in its beauty. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of a storm, and the cold seemed to seep into every bone. Clara had been traveling since dawn, trying to reach the nearby town before nightfall, but the weather had turned unexpectedly harsh. The winds howled like restless spirits, tearing at her thin shawl, and her carriage had broken a wheel hours earlier, leaving her stranded with only a bundle of blankets and what little supplies she could carry. Each step she took in the deepening snow was exhausting. Her boots, though sturdy, were no match for the ice-caked ground. Her hands were stiff with cold, and her lips had begun to crack. She pressed forward, knowing that stopping could mean certain death, yet the world around her had transformed into a swirling maze of white. She could barely see past her own nose. Panic fluttered in her chest, but she tried to steady her breath and keep moving. Every once in a while, she called out, but the wind swallowed her words. No answer came. She was utterly alone. Hours seemed like days. Her strength began to fail her, and her movements slowed until finally, her legs gave way. She fell to the snow-covered ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. Clara's eyes searched desperately for any sign of help, any outline of a building or a tree, but all she could see was the endless whiteness of the storm. She realized, with a chilling clarity, that she might not survive this night. Tears froze on her cheeks as she whispered a quiet prayer, unsure if anyone or anything was listening. Then, through the chaos of the blizzard, a figure appeared. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shadow, moving steadily against the white expanse. Clara squinted, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But the figure drew closer, and soon she could make out the rough silhouette of a man. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, his coat flapping violently in the wind, and a scarf wrapped around his face, leaving only his determined eyes visible. Jonah had been checking his cattle when the storm had trapped him far from his ranch. He knew the land well, but the sudden gusts of wind and heavy snowfall made even familiar paths treacherous. That's when he spotted her, a fragile figure struggling against the storm, clearly in peril. Without hesitation, he rode toward her. The snow had grown so deep that his horse struggled, but Jonah pressed on, guided by the instinct to save a life. He reached her just as she began to slip unconscious, the cold having sapped every ounce of energy from her body. "Hold on, miss, I've got you," he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the wind. Gently, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless in her exhaustion. Jonah's hands were steady, and his heart raced, not from fear, but from the urgency to get her to safety. He mounted his horse, careful to keep her warm against the saddle, and began the slow, perilous ride to his cabin. Every step was a battle against the storm, but Jonah's determination never wavered. He was a man of the West, accustomed to hardship and danger, and yet he had never felt a responsibility so immediate, so personal as he did for Clara. By the time they reached his cabin, night had fallen. Jonah quickly unmounted and carried Clara inside, placing her on a bed of blankets before lighting a fire in the hearth. The warmth began to seep into her frozen limbs, and color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. Jonah removed her wet clothing with gentle care, wrapping her in thick blankets. He poured hot water into a tin cup and brought it to her lips. Clara drank slowly, her fingers trembling as she held the cup. She looked up at him for the first time, without the blinding snow between them. Her eyes were wide with disbelief and gratitude, and she tried to speak, but the words failed her. Jonah gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You're safe now," he said simply. "No grand speeches, no unnecessary questions." In that moment, the storm outside seemed distant, almost unreal. Inside the cabin, there was only warmth, the crackling fire, and the quiet bond forming between two strangers whose lives had collided in the most extraordinary of circumstances. The hours passed slowly. Jonah tended to her frostbitten hands and gave her soup he had prepared in case of visitors or travelers caught in bad weather. Clara, in her weak state, could barely manage words, but she kept looking at him, studying the lines of his face, the strength in his hands, the calm steadiness in his eyes. She realized, with a mix of relief and awe, that this man had risked everything to save her. Her heart, exhausted from fear and cold, felt something unfamiliar, a spark of trust, a fragile hope. As the storm raged on outside, Jonah kept a careful watch. He placed a blanket over her shoulders when he noticed her shivering, and made sure she had enough to drink. Though he had always been a solitary man, the sight of Clara, so vulnerable, awakened something deep within him. He found himself speaking softly, telling her stories of the land, of his cattle, and of the quiet beauty of the plains. She listened, her eyes wide, absorbing not only his words, but the steady kindness in his voice. By dawn, the blizzard had passed. The sky cleared, revealing a soft morning light reflecting off the snow-covered landscape. Clara's strength had returned enough to stand, though she leaned heavily on Jonah. He helped her to the door, and together they stepped outside, the world now calm and beautiful, in contrast to the chaos of the night. The danger was gone, but something unspoken lingered between them, an invisible thread connecting their hearts. Clara turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Jonah merely smiled, tipping his hat with a quiet charm. "No need for thanks. Just take care of yourself." Yet even as he spoke, both knew this meeting was no ordinary encounter. Fate had brought them together in the storm, and their lives were forever changed. The first chapter of their story had ended, but the bond forged in that snowy night would shape every decision, every longing, and every hope that lay ahead. The morning after the blizzard, the world looked calm and inviting, almost deceptively serene. The snow glittered under the pale winter sun, and the air, though crisp, carried a promise of clarity and hope. Yet inside Clara's heart, a storm of emotions raged. She had survived the night, saved by a man whose bravery and kindness had left an indelible mark on her soul. Jonah. She could still feel the warmth of his hands as he had lifted her from the snow, the steady rhythm of his voice as he spoke softly to keep her calm, the unspoken understanding that she was not alone in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. But the reality of life beyond that cabin was pressing. Clara had responsibilities she could not ignore. Her family awaited her in the town several miles away, and the obligations of her journey, work she had committed to, debts she had to settle, letters she had promised to deliver, reminded her that she could not linger, no matter how reluctant her heart might be. She had hoped, fleetingly, that the storm might provide a reason to stay, to grow roots in this isolated cabin with the man who had saved her life. Yet, she also knew the world outside demanded her presence. And the life she had temporarily escaped still needed her. Jonah, too, felt the weight of reality pressing against him. He had lived alone for years, accustomed to the solitude of the plains, the quiet rhythm of ranch life, and the responsibilities that came with tending to cattle, maintaining the land, and surviving the harsh climate. His connection to Clara, forged so suddenly and intensely in the crucible of the blizzard, was unlike anything he had experienced before. There was an undeniable pull, a longing he could not dismiss. Yet he was a man of duty, and he knew that people sometimes had to part, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. That morning, the cabin was quiet, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the wooden walls. Clara had dressed in her thickest garments, each movement deliberate, careful not to disturb the fragile sense of peace that had settled over the room. She had attempted to thank Jonah properly, to articulate the depth of her gratitude, but words seemed too small for the enormity of her feelings. He had simply smiled at her, tipping his hat in his quiet, understated manner that seemed both simple and profound. "Take care of yourself," he had said. And in that brief phrase, 1,000 emotions were conveyed. Concern, hope, and something deeper, almost too subtle to name. As she prepared to leave, she noticed the small tokens Jonah had placed near the door: a warm blanket for her journey, a canteen filled with water, and a bundle of dried bread he had baked himself. Each item was a silent gesture of care, yet it also marked the beginning of a separation neither of them wanted. Clara felt a lump in her throat, a sensation of impending loss she could not yet process. She turned to him, and for a moment, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. The weight of their shared experience hung between them like an unspoken promise. The ride back to town was grueling. The snow, though thinner than the night before, still made travel difficult, and Clara's hands, though warming, were still stiff from frostbite. Jonah guided her carriage with steady hands, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of danger. The silence between them was not awkward. It was filled with the gravity of the bond they had formed, a mutual understanding that life could be fleeting and precious, and that fate sometimes chose moments of intensity to shape the course of one's existence. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, Clara's heart ached. She knew she could not stay. Her life, her obligations, her family, all demanded her attention. Jonah, too, felt a pang of regret, but he said nothing, keeping his emotions carefully guarded behind the stoicism that had defined him for so long. He helped her down from the carriage, steadying her as she took the first tentative steps toward the familiar streets and buildings that marked the beginning of her ordinary life once more. "Will I see you again?" she asked softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts at composure. The words were both a question and a plea, a reflection of the connection that had formed between them in those harrowing hours. Jonah's eyes softened, revealing the depths of the emotion he had tried to contain. He shook his head slightly, a shadow of sadness crossing his rugged features. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Life, it has its ways." And with that, they parted. Clara walked toward the town, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if leaving the cabin and Jonah behind had added invisible weight to her body. The streets of the town, usually bustling with energy, seemed muted and distant, her mind still tethered to the memory of the cowboy who had saved her life. Her family greeted her with relief and joy, yet she could not shake the emptiness that had settled in her chest. Even as she immersed herself in her responsibilities, she found her thoughts drifting back to Jonah, to the warmth of the cabin, to the safety he had provided when the world outside had been merciless. Jonah returned to his ranch, the solitude of his home now more pronounced. Each chore, each routine task, felt strangely hollow without the memory of Clara's presence. He tended to his land and cattle with the same diligence as always. But there was a quiet ache in his heart, a longing that could not be satisfied by work alone. The memory of her, her fragile form against the snow, the way she had looked at him with gratitude and wonder, haunted him. He tried to dismiss it as a passing sentiment, but deep down, he knew it was something more, something permanent. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Clara threw herself into her work, yet she could not ignore the persistent thought of Jonah. Every letter she wrote, every chore she completed, every quiet moment in the evening was accompanied by the memory of the cowboy who had risked everything for her. And Jonah, though he kept himself busy, found that his thoughts often wandered to her as well. He wondered how she fared, if she had recovered fully, if she ever thought of him as he did of her. Their separation was not born of choice, but of circumstance. Life in the West was unpredictable and demanding, and personal desires often had to be set aside for survival and responsibility. Yet the memory of that fateful night, the shared struggle against the blizzard, and the deep, unspoken bond they had formed, remained a powerful force in both their hearts. It was a connection neither could sever, no matter the distance or time. And so, as the seasons changed, a quiet longing settled in. Clara and Jonah lived their separate lives, but both carried the weight of that connection, knowing that their story was far from over. The foundation had been laid in the storm, and though fate had forced them apart, it had also planted a seed that would not die. Somewhere, deep in the plains and the towns of the West, destiny was quietly preparing to bring them back together, testing their patience and resilience, and shaping the circumstances that would eventually allow their paths to converge once more. Months had passed since that harrowing night when Jonah had saved Clara from the blizzard. Yet the memory of his steady hands, quiet strength, and unwavering courage lingered as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Life in town had returned to its normal rhythm, or what passed for normal in a frontier town. Clara attended to her family, managed errands, and tried to immerse herself in daily duties. But no amount of work or chatter could erase the memory of Jonah and the warmth of that cabin where she had felt truly safe for the first time in her life. At first, she tried to convince herself that the bond they had shared in the storm was ephemeral, a product of extreme circumstances. But time only intensified her longing. She thought of Jonah, not as a fleeting hero, but as a man whose quiet strength and moral compass had drawn her in entirely. He had risked his life for hers without hesitation, and that act of selflessness had awakened a feeling in her that she could not deny. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, a connection that had taken root in her heart and refused to fade. The decision to return did not come suddenly. It began with small, almost imperceptible signs, dreams filled with the warmth of the cabin and the glow of the fire, letters she never wrote because she did not know what to say, and a persistent yearning that tugged at her each morning. Clara realized that survival alone was no longer enough. She wanted more than safety and routine. She wanted the life she had glimpsed in those few hours with Jonah, the life where she felt seen, protected, and cherished. One crisp morning, as the first hints of spring melted the snow and allowed the earth to breathe again, Clara made her decision. She packed her belongings carefully, mindful not to leave behind any trace of hesitation. She knew the journey would not be easy. Trails were still treacherous, the weather unpredictable, but she no longer feared the wild plains. The thought of seeing Jonah again, of standing before the man who had saved her life, filled her with determination. Her heart pounded with anticipation and a touch of anxiety, but she pressed on, refusing to let doubt stop her. The journey to Jonah's ranch was arduous. She traveled on horseback, her movements practiced and careful, each mile bringing her closer to the man she could not forget. Along the way, she encountered reminders of the harshness of the West, rivers swollen from melting snow, treacherous cliffs, and wildlife that wandered unpredictably. But each obstacle only reinforced her resolve. She had survived once, and she would survive again, not for herself alone, but for the hope of a future with Jonah. Meanwhile, Jonah's life continued with its steady routine, yet he sensed a subtle shift in the air. Something was coming, though he could not place it. He tended to his ranch as always, repairing fences, checking on the cattle, and maintaining the solitude he had relied upon for years. But there was a quiet restlessness he could not shake. Deep down, he knew that the night of the blizzard had left more than memories. It had left a connection that demanded resolution. On the day Clara returned, Jonah was on the porch, repairing a section of the fence. The sun glinted off the snow-melt streams, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. He heard a distant sound, the soft clip-clop of hooves against the earth, and turned instinctively. At the edge of the horizon, a figure emerged, a woman on horseback, moving steadily yet deliberately toward the ranch. His heart skipped a beat as recognition surged through him. It was her, Clara, alive, resolute, and coming back. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Jonah dropped the hammer he had been using, his rugged hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden rush of emotion he had tried to suppress for months. Clara guided her horse closer, her eyes locked on his. She dismounted gracefully, every movement deliberate, yet filled with a natural elegance, honed by necessity and resilience. As she approached, the distance between them seemed to collapse, and Jonah felt a mix of awe, relief, and overwhelming joy. "Jonah," she said softly, her voice steady but imbued with emotion. The sound of her name on his lips felt like a balm to his restless heart. He stepped forward, his eyes searching hers for any doubt or hesitation, but found none. There was only certainty, courage, and a desire to bridge the months of separation in a single moment. "I came back," Clara continued, her gaze unwavering. "I couldn't stay away. I tried to convince myself that my life here would be enough. But it wasn't. I need to be where I belong. With you." Jonah's chest tightened. He had imagined this reunion countless times in the quiet of his ranch, each scenario less satisfying than reality. Words failed him, as they had when he had first brought her into the cabin during the storm. He simply extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. The connection, forged in adversity and strengthened by months of longing, felt unbreakable. They walked together toward the cabin, side by side, each step a symbolic closing of the distance that had separated them. Inside, the fire still crackled faintly, though the months had cooled the hearth. Jonah quickly rekindled the flames, and the room filled with warmth once again. Clara placed her belongings carefully, not as a visitor, but as someone returning home. She looked around, noticing the small details that had made her feel safe before: the sturdy wooden furniture, the carefully maintained stove, and the quiet order of the space. Each element spoke to Jonah's character, his reliability, and his unwavering sense of care. As the evening settled, they sat together by the fire. Jonah offered her a cup of hot tea, and for the first time since their initial meeting, words flowed freely. They spoke of the months apart, of the longing, the fears, and the choices that had led them to this moment. Clara shared her journey, the obstacles she had faced, and the clarity she had found in understanding where she truly belonged. Jonah listened, interjecting occasionally, but mostly absorbing the certainty and courage she exuded. In the quiet intimacy of that cabin, the harsh west outside seemed to fade. The snow, the wind, the dangers of the plains, all had served their purpose. They had shaped the characters, tested their resilience, and now, in the convergence of their lives, offered the possibility of love, partnership, and a shared future. Clara's return was not just a physical journey. It was a journey of the heart, a decision rooted in courage, hope, and the undeniable truth that some bonds are meant to endure despite time, distance, and circumstance. As night fell and the fire burned low, Clara rested her head against Jonah's shoulder. The storm that had once threatened to end her life had become the catalyst for a love stronger than either could have imagined. She had come back not merely to thank him, but to claim a place by his side, to create a life together built on trust, bravery, and the shared experience of surviving the unforgiving West. In that moment, the promise of a new chapter began. The separation had tested them, but it had also made the reunion infinitely sweeter. And as the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, they both knew, without a doubt, that neither distance nor circumstance could ever sever the bond forged in the storm. Their story, born of peril and hope, was just beginning, and this return marked the true beginning of their life together. The first days after Clara's return passed in a haze of quiet domesticity and cautious excitement. Life on Jonah's ranch was far from easy. The West was as demanding and relentless as ever. But now there was a shared rhythm between them, a dance of mutual care, trust, and growing affection. Clara quickly adapted to the routines of ranch life, learning to ride horseback over long stretches of rough terrain, tend to the animals, and even assist in the more practical aspects of managing the land. Every small task became a chance to strengthen her bond with Jonah, and he, in turn, taught her the subtleties of frontier life with patience and gentle guidance. Jonah was not a man of many words, but Clara had long ago learned to read him in the smallest gestures, the tilt of his head, the shift of his eyes, the quiet way he reached out to help without ever making her feel helpless. Their connection, forged in the crucible of that blizzard, deepened with every shared chore and moment of companionship. Mornings began with the chores of the ranch, feeding the cattle, checking fences, and maintaining equipment, while evenings were spent in the warmth of the cabin, sharing simple meals and quiet conversations. Each day, they built a life not only of survival, but of intimacy, trust, and understanding. But life in the West was never simple, and the couple soon faced trials that tested both their resilience and their commitment to each other. One morning, Jonah discovered that a portion of his herd had wandered near the cliffs during the night, likely spooked by a pack of coyotes. The loss threatened not only their livelihood, but also the fragile security they had established together. Clara, though inexperienced in dealing with wild animals, did not hesitate to ride with Jonah to locate the missing cattle. She trusted his knowledge, but more importantly, she trusted herself to rise to the occasion. Together, they tracked the herd across miles of rugged terrain, facing treacherous snowmelt rivers, slippery rocks, and bitterly cold winds. Through these trials, Clara proved herself not merely as a partner, but as a capable and courageous companion. Jonah, in turn, allowed himself to lean on her in ways he had never done before. In the past, he had carried the weight of survival alone, never admitting fear or vulnerability. With Clara by his side, he discovered that strength could be shared, that courage was amplified when two hearts worked in unison rather than in isolation. Each challenge they faced strengthened their bond, reinforcing the understanding that love on the frontier was as much about resilience and trust as it was about passion and affection. Evenings were a time of reflection and quiet connection. After the physical labor of the day was done, they would sit by the fire, sipping tea or sharing a modest dinner, and talk about the life they wanted to build. Clara often spoke of dreams beyond mere survival, ideas of planting gardens, expanding the cabin, or even opening a small school in the nearby town for children who had little access to learning. Jonah listened carefully, his usually stoic face softening as he absorbed her visions. He realized that love, in its truest form, was not only about protecting and providing, but about nurturing the aspirations of the person you cherished. Their growing intimacy also included small, tender gestures. Jonah would return from the fields with wild flowers he had picked along the ridge, shyly presenting them to Clara with a rare smile. Clara, in turn, baked bread or mended his worn coats, showing her affection through acts of care. These daily exchanges, though simple, became the foundation of a deeper emotional connection. Trust was built not only in grand acts of heroism, like the night of the blizzard, but in the steady, unassuming ways they supported each other day after day. Yet, their life together was not without emotional challenges. The memories of past struggles and losses occasionally resurfaced, particularly for Clara, whose family had once depended entirely on her. She grappled with guilt for leaving them behind, even temporarily, and Jonah had to reassure her repeatedly that she had made the right choice in prioritizing her life and happiness. Similarly, Jonah wrestled with the fear of losing Clara, knowing that the dangers of frontier life were ever present. Fires, wild animals, and the unpredictability of the land reminded them daily that their peace was fragile, and that vigilance was part of love in this harsh environment. Over time, these trials transformed into shared victories: a repaired fence, a safe herd, a successful harvest. Each accomplishment was celebrated not as a solitary achievement, but as a testament to their teamwork and mutual reliance. Clara learned to trust her instincts, realizing that her courage had been latent all along, awakened by necessity and the unwavering presence of Jonah. Jonah, in turn, discovered the joy of allowing himself to love fully, to rely on someone else, and to acknowledge his vulnerabilities without fear. The emotional growth they experienced was mirrored in the way they interacted with the world around them. Neighbors who once saw Jonah as a solitary, stoic man now witnessed the warmth he shared with Clara. Travelers and townsfolk alike noticed the change in him, the subtle softening of his demeanor, and the rare light in his eyes that spoke of deep affection. Clara, too, gained confidence and resilience, no longer the fragile woman lost in a blizzard, but a partner capable of navigating the dangers and responsibilities of frontier life. Spring turned to summer, and the couple's bond was celebrated not only through survival and hard work, but through moments of joy and quiet intimacy. They spent evenings under the vast expanse of the western sky, watching stars reflect off rivers and plains, talking about the future, and sharing dreams that extended far beyond the boundaries of the ranch. They laughed, teased, and comforted each other, creating a life that, though hard-earned, was rich in meaning, trust, and love. By the end of the first year together, it was clear that their partnership had evolved into something far deeper than initial gratitude or romantic fascination. Their love was built on shared experiences, the trials they had endured, and the trust they had cultivated in one another. The man who had saved Clara's life in the blizzard had now become her steadfast partner, and the woman who had returned to him with courage and determination had become an indispensable part of Jonah's world. Their life together was a testament to the idea that love in the West was not only born of passion, but forged through resilience, dedication, and unwavering trust. Even as challenges continued to arise, they faced them with confidence, knowing that together they could weather anything. Their story, which had begun with a fateful night in a blizzard, had transformed into a life of shared purpose, mutual respect, and profound love. The hardships of the frontier had tested them, yet each trial had brought them closer, shaping a relationship that was both unshakable and enduring. In the quiet moments by the fire, amid the routines of ranch life, Jonah and Clara realized that their love was not just a fleeting spark, but a lasting flame, one that would guide them through every storm, every trial, and every chapter yet to come. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that seemed almost impossible in the rugged West. A gentle sun, a soft breeze, and the promise of new beginnings. Jonah's ranch, which had been a quiet, hard-working place of routine and labor, now buzzed with anticipation. Neighbors, friends, and a few townsfolk had gathered to witness the union of two lives forged in the crucible of hardship, courage, and enduring love. The modest celebration reflected both their humble lives and the magnitude of the journey that had brought them together. Clara stood near the cabin window, adjusting the simple dress she had chosen. It was not elaborate, but the fabric flowed gracefully, and the subtle embroidery told the story of her care and attention to detail. She touched the locket around her neck, a gift Jonah had given her the first winter they had spent together, and felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. This day was more than a ceremony. It was the culmination of months of longing, courage, trust, and shared hardships. Every challenge they had faced, every trial on the harsh plains, had led to this moment of joy. Outside, Jonah made his final preparations, checking the arrangement of chairs, ensuring the horses were safely stabled, and adjusting the simple wooden arch under which they would exchange their vows. He paused for a moment, running a hand through his hair, and felt the weight of all that had transpired since that fateful night in the blizzard. The memory of finding Clara nearly frozen in the snow, carrying her to safety, and watching her recover, now seemed both distant and intensely vivid. He had never imagined that moment would lead to this, the certainty that the woman who had returned to him would soon become his wife, his partner, in every sense. As the guests took their places, the plains seemed to hold their breath, the wind carrying a quiet sense of reverence. Clara stepped outside, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape that had witnessed the first chapter of their story. She saw Jonah waiting, his strong frame silhouetted against the horizon, the sunlight catching the edges of his hat and the lines of his rugged features. Her heart swelled with emotion. All fear, doubt, and uncertainty melted away, replaced by a profound sense of belonging. Jonah met her halfway, and for a moment, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. The months of separation, the trials of frontier life, and the shared experiences of survival and triumph had conveyed everything their hearts needed to say. The townsfolk and neighbors watched quietly, sensing the depth of the bond between them. Clara reached out, taking Jonah's hands in hers, feeling the calluses and strength that had saved her life and supported her in the months since. Jonah's eyes softened as he looked at her, seeing not only the woman who had returned, but the partner who had faced the challenges of the West with courage and determination. The ceremony was simple, yet profoundly moving. The local preacher spoke of love, trust, and the courage required to build a life together in a land as unforgiving as the frontier. Clara and Jonah exchanged vows that were not only words of affection, but promises rooted in shared experience and mutual respect. Clara promised to stand by Jonah, to share in both hardship and joy, and to nurture the home they would build together. Jonah vowed to protect, support, and cherish Clara, acknowledging that their love had been forged in adversity and strengthened by trust. As they exchanged rings, simple bands reflecting the practicality of their lives, they sealed a commitment that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. The reception that followed was lively in a rustic, heartwarming way. Neighbors brought food, stories, and laughter, celebrating not only the couple's union, but the resilience, courage, and dedication that had brought them to this day. Clara danced barefoot on the soft earth with children from the town, her laughter mingling with the sound of wind through the trees and the gentle murmur of the plains. Jonah watched her with a quiet, steady joy, grateful for the woman who had chosen to return, who had brought life and love into his once solitary existence. Amid the festivities, the couple found quiet moments to reflect on their journey. Sitting by the fire that evening, now blazing brightly after months of use and care, they held hands and recounted the story of how they had met, survived, and ultimately found each other. They spoke of the blizzard, the separation, the return, and the trials that had tested their resilience. Each recollection was met with shared smiles, occasional tears, and a deepening sense of intimacy. They understood that their love was not born solely of passion or romance, but had been forged in the fires of adversity, solidified by trust, and nurtured by mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Jonah settled into their married life with the same determination and teamwork that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. They expanded the cabin, planted a garden, and improved the ranch, creating a home that reflected their shared values, work ethic, and love. The hardships of frontier life continued. The unpredictable weather, occasional illness, and the ever-present dangers of wild animals. But now they face these challenges together, their bond a source of strength and inspiration. The community around them watched in admiration as the couple thrived. Jonah, once a solitary figure, known only for his stoicism and resilience, now radiated warmth and quiet happiness. Clara, who had arrived at his ranch as a fragile traveler, blossomed into a confident and capable partner. Her strength matched only by her compassion and intelligence. Together, they became a symbol of hope, love, and perseverance in a world often defined by hardship and unpredictability. As the sun set on the plains, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Jonah and Clara stood together outside their cabin, hands intertwined, hearts full. The snow of the past had melted into rivers that nourished the land. The blizzard of their first encounter replaced by the calm certainty of shared life and love. They had survived, grown, and built something enduring. A life together founded on courage, trust, and the unwavering commitment to one another. In that moment, it was clear that the journey they had begun with fear and uncertainty had led to a life rich with love, purpose, and connection. Their wedding was not merely a celebration of a single day, but a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the power of fate, and the transformative force of love. Clara had returned to the man who had saved her life, and together, they had built a future that honored their past, embraced the present, and looked forward with hope to every season yet to come. As night fell and stars blanketed the vast western sky, they stood side by side. Knowing that the love they shared was unshakable, the blizzard that had first brought them together now seemed almost like a distant memory, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life could produce moments of extraordinary courage, connection, and joy. And in the warmth of their cabin, surrounded by the love they had nurtured and the life they had created, Clara and Jonah knew without doubt that they were home, together, forever.